Hello, my friends. In this video, I'm going to explain a procedure that I use to predict the outcome of a political or social event. I've made a lot of these predictions of who will win an election, what the outcome of a war will be. Done many of these. Let me show you some of the, quote, secrets that I use to do this, and I'm going to demonstrate an example of exactly how this happens. So here are some examples. Let's look at a few examples of what I mean by a political or social event. For example, a person announces that they're running for president. Often they do this, as an official thing, a public statement. I am running for president. And we astrologers write down that time, very exact for when that statement happens. Yes, that moment of making the statement, of making it public, does have an effect. And what effect does it have? It will tell you how the campaign goes. Specifically the campaign. Of course, the campaign is going to have an effect on the election and who will win, but it's not like the announcement is some like reflection. It'll get repeated in the election when the voting happens. It tells you how the campaign evolves, develops, what the themes are, what the issues are, which in turn does affect the election. But it's very important to think about this very clearly so you understand exactly what's happening. Another example, a war breaks out. What's going to happen with this war? Who's likely to gain strength during the war? What are the strategies involved? What are the issues? And really important, what are the motivations behind it? Another example is someone gets murdered. Now, this can be extremely helpful because sometimes it's not known who committed the crime. We just have the moment of it. And even without the birth data of the person who committed the crime, you still can see a lot of what's going on. And you can get hints about what the motivation is. It will help investigators track down what's going on. Also, it's tremendous for preventing these situations in the future because you understand what's happening. That's also true with wars. So there are ways to do this. And what are the ways to do it? Step number one. I'm just telling you what I do, right? I mean, there's probably are other things that work. This is what I do. Number one, before I go in and start saying what's going to happen, I do not jump right to my astrological theory. This is typically what we do in astrology. We say, oh, this is my theory. This is how this works. This rising sign does this. And we start saying what will happen. What I do is I analyze at least 3 other very similar events before I proceed. And when I look at those similar events, I look for very consistent and very clear rules that appear to work. Now, what if I don't have 3 other similar events? What do? I don't make a prediction. It's that simple. I don't feel confident. So I use this evidence-based system of astrology. It's not just a pretty set of words. There's certain rules and regulations for how we do this. We have to look at very similar cases. Excuse me. So, and we come up with very clear rules, not like, oh, in this case, it was all this, and in another case it's this. If it's different things in different cases, why? We have to have some kind of clear steps so that when we look at a new event, we're not guessing and jumping between a lot of different things. We say, okay, this is it. We go for it. So, and I'm going to show you examples of this. You might think, oh, well, that's too restrictive. That's too narrow. It works. It really works. I'm going to show you an example of it. So you find the rules and then you rely on them. And that might sound obvious, but a lot of times we have rules and then we look at the chart, we see all these other things, and we go off on all these tangents that we see and that inspire us and they make sense. Just stick to the rule. Don't make it complicated. You've found something that works, rely on it, and very often it will surprise you. And in the example I give you, I was completely surprised. Like, whoa, this is what's going on? I wasn't expecting it, didn't make sense to me. Sure enough, it was true. So, this is the great thing. We're not using astrology to justify what we think or to look for what we think is there. It's actually providing information we don't know about. No, excuse me. So, well, here I don't say, actually in my notes here on this slide, I say, if you cannot do this, proceed with very limited confidence. Well, that's actually more realistic in the sense that if there's an election coming up and I want to know who's going to win, it doesn't mean, well, I don't have any cases. I have to, I can't look at the charts. Well, we're astrologers. We're going to look at the charts. Excuse me. I think I need some water. We need to look at those charts and we need to see, what we want. And we can use our theory. Our theories work. We're not completely blind if we don't have similar examples, but you have to tremendously lower your confidence. Very, very, mild in what you say, very reserved. Just say, well, I think it might be this. So if you don't have those examples, you're just not very confident. And here are the rules that I came up with. Points number 2 and 3. The rules that I found to work consistently. This leaves out many, many other things. I don't use eclipses and prenatal lunations, etc. Does that mean I don't think they work? No, it just means I haven't investigated them carefully enough. So you use a limited set of ideas that you're comfortable with and that you've validated. Don't start guessing and trying out new methods when you're telling people something and providing information and making a forecast. Use that subset that you are comfortable with. And don't worry about it. It doesn't mean you're against anything else. It just means this is what you've made solid progress with. And here are the 2 things I do. If I have the birth data of the person involved, typically there's a person involved, like the examples I gave of somebody announcing they're running for an election, or if there's an invasion of a country, a war breaks out, there's a general, often a president or prime minister or somebody who directed that action. If we have the birth data for that person, we use it and especially look at the transits at that moment. So typically we do have the data of the event because news reports will give it to you to the minute, invariably. Excuse me. Astrologers will dig it up. We'll find it. They're watching the news report and they've got their, exact time. So usually we have the time of the event if it's a major event. What we don't always have is the birth time of the people involved. If you have that time of the people involved, the transits to that person's chart at that moment are extremely powerful. They tell you what part of the person, what planetary configuration in their chart is being activated, how it's being activated, and what it means to them. Wow. I mean, it's not always obvious just looking at the news and seeing what's happening, what's behind all of it. So that's a help, but you can only do it, obviously, if you have a birth time for the person. If I don't have a birth time, in the vibrational astrology we can't do that much. We just don't do it. And you can also look at the progressions in solar arc directions. But when you're using progressions in solar arc directions, you're not focused as much on the moment. Like, the invasion began at, 5:02 in the morning. The first, missile was sent out, or the announcement was made. You're looking more at the overall trends and movements and developmental process for the people involved. So you're seeing what phase, what's happening. It's not as crystal clear, but it will show you a momentum. So if you're seeing secondary progressed Sun approaching natal Jupiter, as we head towards election, we know that person's becoming more extroverted, more expressive, more engaged in the world, reaching out more. Jupiter's not this great benefic that makes everything just work. but it makes things big and expand and overlook details. And you'll see that momentum, that process, as a theme and developmental process for the person. Progressions and transits tend not to trigger the details of the events as clearly as the transits. So, and the progressions at the moment of the event are not as critical, because here's a way to think of it. The transits at the moment of the event, at the moment that the candidate says, I'm running for president, that's also a birth chart. That's the birth chart of that process, of that beginning of the campaign. So it's an imprint, and the progressions are something developmental for you. Okay, third thing is, what if you don't have a time for the people involved? What do? You can interpret the chart of the event. So whether you have the time or not, you can always interpret just that event chart. And it's surprisingly, at least to me, surprisingly powerful. It describes what it is, especially very descriptive if the event is a collective event, like the beginning of a war. So if a president or a prime minister directs the forces and is really the ultimate person behind this, and it goes to war, well, that's engaging the whole country. And it's that person's decision, but it's not so much about their personal immediate life. If you announce you're running, the emphasis is on you. The spotlight is on you. Here I am. I'm running. And it's just more, yes, you're going to serve the country, in an intellectual way. You might say, yes, it's just as much a collective thing. But energetically, the emphasis is more on you as an individual. So my point is this. When the event is very collective, like the beginning of a war, and there were probably a lot of advisors and so on involved, much more than starting a campaign where you might be talking to just your campaign advisor and your family. So it's more collective, then the event chart becomes, in a way, more reliable about the whole large activity. Otherwise it's just personal to you. Okay, so that's what I do. Now we'll give you an example. Let me give you an example of doing this. So I have here in a smaller type at the top here, a reminder of what step 1 is. Analyze at least 3 similar events. I analyzed 6 events that were described as Islamic terrorist attacks. So that's how they're labeled. For example, you can go to this website, wikipedia.org/blah, blah, blah. Just go to Wikipedia and search for terrorism in the United States, terrorist, and you will see, just go there and type in terrorism in the United States, and you'll go to this website, and they list different terrorist events in the United States, and they label them as different kinds. And one of the labels is extremist Islamic. So it's good to rely on standard sources, you might say authorities, well agreed upon things, rather than just sit there and conjure up, gee, what can I remember? This way it's more data driven, more not as much dependent on whatever you happen to think of or connect to. So I go to a list like that. I found 6 events. That wasn't the only list I went to. I went to several, found 6 events with times. I looked at them, and I just interpreted the chart. Just what was happening at that moment. I almost never have the birth time of the perpetrator of the terrorist activity. I just don't have it. But just using only that time of the event and having 6 of them and looking very closely, it's really, for us astrologers, wonderfully positive. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily expect such consistency. It's just amazing that you will see these themes repeat. Now you've got it. Now when there's another event and the news hits and you look at it, you see, are the same things happening? And I'm going to show you this. I'm going to show you 2 of the 6 events that I analyzed. And when you have these events, by the way, The more similar they are, the better. No two events are identical, obviously. They're different events. But the more similar they are in terms of motivation, in terms of what kinds of people are involved, what they were doing, how they executed it, maybe they're on very different levels of scale. One might be larger. All events are different. But the more similar they are, the better. So you just get the ones that you can. If they're labeled the same, the fundamental basic theme is the same, well, that's already very similar right there. So what I'm looking at, to be a little more specific, are, to read from the bottom of this slide, attacks from, let me read up earlier. Let me read this section up here. I analyzed 6 events that are described as Islamic terrorist attacks by people who are not of American descent. So you can get kind of specific. What are we looking at? People who are not born and raised in America as, quote, Americans, and they have negative feelings about America. They may be living in America at the time, but they weren't. It's not their original tradition, and they have very negative feelings about specifically American foreign policy and Western foreign policy in general, such as NATO, and they get labeled as Islamist extremist attacks. Attacks from Americans who are unhappy. There are terrorist attacks from Americans. It's a different heritage, a different motivation. The planetary configurations can be different. If you go to something even more different, like school shootings, big problem here in the United States that people take guns and knives, etc., especially guns, to school and they just start shooting, and they're generally Americans who actually live in those communities, have participated in them. It's a different dynamic. You can't just say, oh, this is an explosion, it's an attack. Those details make a lot of difference. And sometimes the charts are very different. So what we found in vibrational astrology is not like a symbolic thing. Oh, you have an attack, you have violence against people. There must be this that symbolizes that. It's the specific details that change it. Although you might find similarities in the school shootings by people who live in those communities versus the extremist Islamic style of terrorism. Maybe there are similarities, but don't assume that. Okay. So let's do it. Let's see an example of what I did. And I want to show you a realistic sense of what I'm doing. So I'm not going to go through all 6 charts that I looked at. I'm just going to take 2 that were very, very similar and kind of conspicuous in the news and so on. And that is the Boston Marathon bombing. I think that was in 2013. We'll look at the chart in a minute to verify that. And the 9/11, September 11, 2011 attack on the Twin Towers in New York City. And then we're going to apply what we learned from those 2 charts. And there were others that confirmed this as well. But what is the consistent thing? It's amazingly consistent, even though they're very different. I mean, one is airplanes going into these big skyscrapers. The other is 2 people making a much smaller bomb, a much simpler operation in a sense, less involved, less the Twin Towers. You have to hijack the planes. It's kind of a big organized, like a big engineering problem. I'm not minimizing how much was involved in the planning for the Boston Marathon bombing, but it is compared to the 9/11, smaller scale. 2 guys made these bombs that they learned how to make, and they set them off at places. It's something that is relatively easy to do and doesn't require as large an operation. But they're very similar. The motivations are similar. You're never going to find 2 things that are like extremely similar, almost never. Then we look at the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. which to me is just a totally different thing. It's just not that similar. But when I looked at the chart, it looks strikingly similar to those two charts. Whoa! I didn't expect that. That's what I love about this astrology. You learn things. And then I said, oh my gosh, same configurations. It means that very similar dynamics, very similar kinds of outcomes. Even though it's not labeled the same, even though the heritage isn't exactly the same, extremely similar. And that's how I made my forecasts. And the forecasts have been like crazy accurate. I've made, 5 or 6 videos. And one of the last ones I made, I got something a little bit wrong. I've been like, perfect. Oops, this is a little bit wrong. I made that about a month ago. I'm making this video in late April. And I think I made that video about a month ago or so. And then I, with a follow-up, and I said, oops, I got that wrong. Well, now, looking back at it a month later, even the thing I got wrong is not as wrong as it seemed at the moment. It reminds me a little bit of when I predicted that Donald Trump would get the nomination to be, for the Republican Party, you become the nominee and would run. And then later I said, oh my gosh, this guy could actually even win, despite the fact that the news media said that he couldn't. So that was like incredibly accurate. But I made a video after the campaigns began, because Trump did very badly at the beginning, and all the news media said he has no chance. And I said, oh, looks like I was wrong. Well, I ended up being right. Similar thing with the Russian thing. I said, oops, I was completely wrong. But now, a month later, oh, not so wrong after all. Anyway, the point is, it's amazing how well the astrology works. It's not me, it's the astrology, and you can learn how to do this. Okay, and that prediction was about the fall of, I said Bakhmut would probably fall. It didn't fall, but and the news was saying, oh, the what's it called, Wagner Group, they're going to leave, they're going to go to Africa. It's a failure. Russia's out of here. It's not working. Well, no, it ended up that through March, the Russians continue to take over Bakhmut, and I can maybe do a follow-up video. It shows how they just moved in, took over the center of the city. They didn't completely take it over, but now in late April, they've got like 90% of it. Anyway, it's not as far off as was said. Point is, this stuff works. All right, let's get into this. Maybe I spent a few minutes on that. Let's get into these charts. First of all, the Boston Marathon bombing. What is it? So to quote from this Wikipedia article, the Boston Marathon bombing was a domestic terrorist attack that took place during the annual Boston Marathon. So in Boston, Massachusetts, they have this race. You just run and see who comes in first and whatever. It's very popular. It's a lot of fun. And it was on April 15th, 2013. And these two brothers, Jokar and Tamerlan, I think I spelled it wrong there, Sarnev, sorry about the mispronunciations. I should have practiced that ahead of time. They planted 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs, which detonated near the finish line of the race, 14 seconds apart from each other and 210 yards apart from each other. So these 2 bombs went off. 14 seconds, very short time in between them. 3 people were killed, hundreds were injured. 17 lost limbs. So these were big bombs, just homemade pressure cooker bombs. Like I said, not as big of an engineering complex operation as the Twin Towers, and not as a massive scale. And during question, well, the one brother, Tamerlan, if I remember what even the spelling was, he died in the process of tracking them down and everything. And the brother Jokar lived, and he said that he and his brother were motivated by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that they were self-radicalized and unconnected to any outside terrorist groups, and that he was following his brother's lead. So there you have it. People with a heritage outside the U.S. that were living in the U.S. and upset about especially U.S. foreign policy and the way that America is treating, you might say, their homeland. Very similar to the 9/11. And the September 11 attacks, to quote from this, or coordinated suicide terrorist attacks carried out by the militant Islamist extremist network Al-Qaeda against the United States. So that was a more orchestrated, larger operation as part of a whole network. So one is a bigger operation, one's a smaller one, and the impacts were different. Going over this, because we can actually see these differences in the little differences between the charts. And here are the natal charts. The magic, these powerful planetary configurations are not, that I found, are not obvious in the natal chart, but there it is, just so you can look at it. And you can see, here's the 9/11. Huge historical event, enormous consequences, enormous damage, enormous effect on history. What's going on? Mercury's rising in Libra. What does that have to do with close trine to Saturn? I know what astrologers do. They often look at these patterns and they say, okay, what's ruling the 8th house of death? And, oh, it's in the 9th house of philosophy. But just look at it objectively. Would you be able to see this as the 9/11 attack? Is it even possible? And do we have to resort to things that are just made up in the moment and aren't necessarily consistent and could have so many different ways of expressing themselves? Well, maybe you can see something here that's clear and consistent. If you can, you get several other examples of similar types of attacks and see if you can see the same kinds of things. I couldn't see it in the natal charts, but I'll show you what I did find. Here's the, let's see, this was in 2001, so 12 years later, in 2013, is the Boston Marathon bombing. So there's the chart for it, with Neptune on the 7th house, etc. You can pause this, obviously, look at it. There's the Sun, Mars conjunction, sextile the Moon, etc. Do you see something that could be consistent and clear? Is it even possible for astrology to be that precise? And here's the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia on February 24th, 2022. And I did not expect it to have any similarities or obvious strong similarities, but oh my God, it's extremely similar. And the predictions are extremely accurate and different from what a lot of the media was saying and working out very differently. And they've changed their tune to sound a lot more like what I said immediately after the war, which at the time didn't make any sense to me. But I trust the astrology. In other words, the astrology said something, I said, oh my God, that's a shock. But the astrology knows more than I do, and it's shown to be true. Now here's what I found. Let's see, we are at 28 minutes. I think I'm going to take a break here and do a part 2. I'd like to go for about a half hour at most. Let's break here, and in the second part, this is a good place to stop. I will show you what it is that I found in these two charts, and I have done others of Islamic, what they call extreme Islamic terrorist attacks. By the way, I don't want to beat up on any particular religion. There are extremist Christian attacks, lots of them. So I just want to make that clear politically. Just anything can go good or bad. So anyway, in the next video, I'll show you what I see in these two charts, was also in other charts, and how it got repeated in Russia and what the slight differences are. Okay, next video, what is the magic formula that I found? I gave you the procedure, which is extremely important for how to make your own discoveries, and now I'll show you the discovery that was made with this and how it became very useful and very accurate. And if the U.S. military and politicians would understand this, if we could consult them, because a lot of them completely don't understand what's going on, and policy consequently is not very good, it would help enormously. Okay, even if your objective is as simple as, I want to defeat the enemy, if it's that simple, well, it helps to know the enemy to defeat them, if that's your point of view. Okay, let's take a break, and part 2, what is the magic formula? Okay, that's it for now. Thank you very much, my friends, for listening, and we'll have part 2 as a follow-up.